Acts 14. If you were with us, basically we've been going through Paul and Barnabas's, and this would be considered Paul's first missionary journey. They started in Antioch, moved to the island of Cyprus, then to Pisidia, and that's where John Mark left them. And then they worked their way up to another Antioch, which is not the same Antioch, a different Antioch. And then today we are going to be talking about their time in Iconium. And oftentimes Paul wanted to stay in a place for a long time because he knew that the Christians that he was leaving behind were going to be persecuted just like he was persecuted. So he wanted to stay in places a long time. And we saw in Antioch that there was persecution that pushed him out of Antioch. And in a way, we can look at that and say that this was God pushing him out of Antioch to another place, to spread the gospel in another location. And this location we'll read about in the beginning of Acts 14, and it's a place called Iconium. So let's dive in. This is verse 1. It happened in Iconium that they went together to the synagogue of the Jews, and so spoke that a great multitude, both of the Jews and the Greeks, believed. So this is exactly the same way that Paul and Barnabas started in Antioch, right? They started their time in the synagogue. I think they did this because there was success there. In Antioch, they saw people were believing what they were saying. And the same thing we read here, that not just a multitude, but a great multitude, both Jews and Greeks, believed. And if you've heard, you may know the definition of insanity. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Well, I heard a friend of mine actually said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting the same result. Now, this sounds like what Paul is doing, right? Now, the definition that I've heard for sanity is making sane decisions or making decisions based on the truth. And that first one is kind of what Paul's doing. Like, he knew that a great place to start was the synagogue, and he goes to this synagogue, and he probably was expecting that God was going to move in that synagogue, but he was also expecting the same result, that he was probably going to get some persecution. And that's what we see happen. But it says he spoke, and a great multitude believed. See, they had success amongst the Greeks and the Jews here, presenting the same gospel to both. It wasn't a different gospel. It was that Jesus, our salvation is in Jesus, and we receive it by our belief, putting our faith in him. And I am the Celebrate Recovery pastor here at the church. And at Celebrate Recovery, right now we're talking about doing a inventory, doing a personal moral inventory. And I think that in an inventory, you have to do the good and the bad events that happen in your life. You're writing them down. And I think it's important that Paul and Barnabas had some success here because you want to write the good things that happen because it helps you to keep going. And these good things that God is revealing himself to these people in these synagogues and the people are believing is helping him persevere through the persecution. And we'll actually read about the persecution in the very next verse, verses 2 through 6. It says, "But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. Therefore they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the multitude of the city was divided. Part sided with the Jews and part sided with the apostles. And when a violent attempt was made by both the Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to abuse and stone them, they became aware of it, and they fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding regions." So, again, persecution is happening once again to Paul. And you'll see that a recurring theme is perseverance through trials. Persevering when persecution comes. All through this first journey. If you don't get anything out of this, that's what we see, this perseverance through persecution. And we see the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned them against the brethren. And it says against the brethren here. I think that's interesting because they weren't just going against the message that the messengers that Paul and Barnabas were giving. they were poisoning the minds against the people who were actually saying it, against the brethren, against Paul and Barnabas. And I think this still happens today. You know, if you try to share your faith, share the gospel with someone, and oftentimes people will throw your past in your face. Will throw stuff in your face and try to make you look like a hypocrite and try to discredit what you're trying to say by discrediting you. And actually, I saw this happen just this last week. Many of you probably watched the Super Bowl, and I had a friend on Facebook who was commenting on the halftime show with J-Lo and Shakira, right? And she was putting her Christian belief, how she didn't agree with all the provocative dancing and the provocative language and all of that. And I mean, for me, it's like, what do we expect from the world, right? The world, that kind of stuff is expected. It's accepted by the world. We live in a world that idolizes sexuality. And she was posting about it, and on her comments, there was like 100 comments. And this in particular lady has a really horrid past. But just like we talked about a couple weeks ago, she had a but God moment in her life, and God completely changed her life. But it didn't stop those people in the comments just throwing trash on her character, on who she was, just so they can discredit what she was saying. And whether you agree with her or not, what you think, I don't know about the halftime show, but in my opinion, what we saw at the halftime show, it may be acceptable here on earth, but we're not going to see any of that in heaven. So that's what we see Paul and Barnabas, what's happening to them, that they're trying to share the gospel, and people are poisoning the minds of the people against them. But the author of Acts, Luke, he makes it clear that it's not all the people in this city. Right in the beginning, that very first verse, it says a multitude of people believed. It wasn't everybody. So they began to get this persecution, and people were poisoning the minds of people against them, and they hightailed it out of there. No, that's not what it says. It says, therefore they stayed a long time. They stayed as long as they could. Again, this is Paul's MO. Despite the opposition, leaving only when it was absolutely necessary. They did this because they knew the Christians in Iconium, they needed grounding. They needed to be encouraged more because they knew when they left, that persecution wasn't going to leave with them. It was going to stay there. It was going to be against the people that they left behind. So he knew that they needed more encouraging, more grounding in the faith. And listen to what God does. It says, and I think this is because a great multitude of people believed. You know, when Jesus did miracles, when he entered in a town that didn't have much faith, he didn't do many miracles. But when he entered a town when there was a lot of faith, he did a lot more miracles. And we see in the verse 1 that a multitude of believers believed. And I believe that it's because of this great multitude that believed God, that God granted Paul and Barnabas, it says that granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. You know, the apostles, they couldn't do these wonders and signs on their own. It needed to be granted by God. And why? Why were these signs granted by God? It says, to bearing witness to the word of his grace. These miraculous signs that were being done, it just pointed to the fact that what Barnabas and Paul were preaching was true. This word of his grace. And it's called the word of his grace, and it's referring to the gospel, but it calls it the word of grace because that's the subject matter here. He's talking about grace. And remember we talked about grace a couple weeks ago. It's a gift from God that we receive when we put our faith in Christ, that he loves us and he paid the price on the cross for us to have eternal life with him forever because he loves us. And then what happens? We see what I call the great divide, right? Some parted with the Jews and some parted with the apostles. And then a violent attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to abuse and stone them. Paul and Barnabas left Iconium for Lystra after this. Their perseverance under this difficult time, didn't mean it was time for them to be martyrs. God wasn't ready for them to die yet right here because he had something more for them in other towns. So they were made aware of it. So when they were made aware of it, they fled. And they fled first to this place called Lystra. Verses 7 through 10. And they were preaching the gospel there. And in Lystra, a certain man without strength in his feet was sitting, a crippled man from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, "Stand up straight on your feet and leap and walk." So we see that Paul's preaching here, and this crippled man hears him preaching, and he believes. And we've heard about these miraculous signs, and this is one of them here, recorded here. And it's important for us to recognize that Paul and Barnabas didn't travel as miracle workers, right? They traveled as gospel carriers. They wanted to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And because of this sharing the gospel, God was granting them miracles such as the one we're reading about. And this crippled man, again, heard Paul preaching about Jesus. And when he heard, something must have been like in his face or in his manner that showed that he believed that Jesus could heal him from his crippledness, that he was from the womb. And that's exactly what we see, that Paul sees him. He must have recognized something in the man, and he tells him to get up and walk. And what's interesting is this certain man that was crippled from his mother's womb, so from the time he was born, he was crippled. He made an important transition in his life. He went from hearing the works of Jesus Christ. We come to church every Sunday, and we hear the works of Jesus Christ, these miraculous signs. He died on the cross. We hear it every Sunday, maybe even other days of the week. And that's exactly, this man hears it, but he makes a transition from not just hearing it, but believing that it's for him. And many people don't make that transition, but we should. Now, have you made that transition? Do you believe the work that Jesus did on the cross is for you? Because it is. Jesus died on the cross for everybody so we can have forgiveness of sins. So I find it interesting in Lystra because the two other places we read about in Antioch and then in Iconium, they entered into the synagogue, right? And for a city to have a synagogue, there had to have been at least 10 prominent Jewish men living in that city. And we don't see that in Lystra. In Lystra, the people in Lystra more believed in the Greek mythology, like Zeus and Hermes and stuff like that. So when they see this miraculous miracle, if they saw this in Iconium, they saw this in Antioch, they would praise and glorify God for it. But in Lystra, it's kind of a humorous, but not really, thing that happens. This is 11 through 13. See, now when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, which, by the way, the Lycaonian language, Paul and Barnabas would have no idea what they were saying. They didn't understand the Lycaonian language. So this is what they say in the Lycaonian language. It says, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of the city, brought oxen and garland to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. So they see this miraculous miracle, and they automatically think, oh, it's our gods who did this. It's the Greek gods. See, they see this miracle, and their idea of God isn't changed. And it seemed logical to them that Barnabas and Saul were gods. Because in the Greek mythology, it's actually, it was common for the Greek gods to come down in the likeness of man, to come down to earth, but not always for the good of man. And actually in this town in particular, in Lystra, there was a legend that the exact same two that they're mistaking him for, that Zeus and Hermes, comes down to Lystra in the likeness of man and no one there gave him any hospitality except for an older couple, a elderly couple. And the elderly couple gave him some hospitality, so they destroyed the whole city except for that elderly couple. That was the myth, the legend of the Greek gods in Lystra. And it made sense that when they see this miraculous sign, their brains went automatically to, oh my gosh, Zeus and Hermes are back. We got to do the opposite of what they did last time. We don't want our city destroyed, so let's praise them. Let's give them honor and glory. And that's exactly what we see them doing here. And it's interesting they call Paul Hermes. Hermes was known as the messenger of the gods. So it made sense that they would call Paul Hermes because he was the more talkative one. He was the outspoken one. Whereas Barnabas, maybe he just had an air of authority about him, is why they called him Zeus. And probably also because of this legend of Zeus and Hermes coming down, that those are the two logical gods that would come back to the city. And I can just imagine Paul and Barnabas' reaction when they finally realize, oh man, they're about to bring oxen and garland now. They're about to sacrifice in front of us. This is more than just honoring people in the city. This is something completely different. See, the Lycaonian people had their own idea of who God is. And we'll see that Paul's reaction to it in the coming verses in 14 through 18. He says, but when the apostle Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitude, crying and saying, men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heavens, the earth, the seas, and all the things in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own way. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good. He gave us rain from heaven in fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings, they could scarcely retain the multitude from sacrificing to them. So their first initial reaction was to tear their clothes. They did this, I think, for two reasons. The first reason is to show that they were merely men, and that's exactly what he says, that we are men just like you. And the second reason is that was a Jewish thing. That was a Jewish reaction to blasphemy, that they were claiming that they were God, so they had this reaction to tear their clothes. For Paul and Barnabas, it wasn't just inconvenient that they thought they were gods. It was blasphemy. So the reaction fit the crime. And then Paul says some pretty strong words. He says that you should turn from these useless things. Now, is this politically correct in today's society? I mean, if I went to somewhere where these people were believing in something different and I just said, you need to turn from these wicked things to the living God. In today's society, that wouldn't be politically correct, right? I mean, I don't think so. But Paul, it didn't matter to Paul. It didn't matter that was politically correct or not. These were strong words that Paul spoke to a group of people who took this pagan worship seriously, right? But Paul wasn't afraid to confront this mob with the truth of the gospel, with the truth that their idolatry of these Greek gods was wrong, and they had to turn from it. See, Paul, as he preached more and more about Jesus, he especially wanted them to turn from these useless things. They couldn't be just added to these pagan gods. Jesus couldn't be just, okay, we believe in Jesus now. We'll put him up here with our shrine to Zeus. No, he wanted them to turn away from those things and turn to the one and only living God. And if you notice how he's sharing the gospel, how he's telling them about Jesus and about God here. And it's different from how he shares to the people in the synagogues and the people in Iconium and in Antioch. Because those people are familiar with the Judaism, but these people aren't. So it's different how he approaches them. And he says this, he says, to the living God who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all the things that are in them. See, he called the Lystra people to consider the real God, the one who stands behind all creation, not one of the lesser gods, one of these Greek gods that they worship. And in verse 17, he goes on to talk about it. He said, he did good, speaking of God, gave us rain from heaven in fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. These are the things that the Lystra people thought that Zeus was giving them. And Paul was saying, no, no, no. The living God, the God who created all this that you see, he is the one who gave it to you. See, Paul was appealing to the natural revelation, to the things that these pagans would understand. So they wouldn't understand if he went up to them and said, well, this is what the Old Testament says. These are the prophecies that spoke about Jesus. They wouldn't understand that like the Jewish communities would. But they would understand nature. So he appeals to them in a natural way that look at this earth. Look at what God created. All these things are things that God created. Yet, even though he explained it to them in a way that they can understand, this miraculous miracle that they did with them, they still, it says that they couldn't retain the multitude from sacrificing to them. They had a difficult time challenging the wrong conceptions of God that the Lycaonian people had. Now, when going over this, I think, how many of us sitting in this room have our own idea of who God is? Maybe you may not think that God's a Greek God or a different God, but you have your own idea and you put your own label on who God is. Perhaps, you're looking at your earthly father, and that's how you label your heavenly Father. So what Paul is trying to portray to them is to acknowledge that there is one living God. And I think Paul wants us to acknowledge that God exists. Romans 1, 20 through 21. And I imagine, I don't know this for a fact, but I can imagine that he had this Lycaonian town in his mind when he wrote this. He says, for since the creation of the world, this invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And in Hebrews 11:6, it tells us, anyone who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So we first must acknowledge that God exists. When I talk about this, I often talk about the watch example. And those that you that have heard me preach, you maybe heard me give this example before. But say you have a watch, right? And you take all the pieces of the watch apart. You take all of them apart, so there's all the pieces, and you put them in a bag. And you shake them up. You shake them up and shake them up forever. When you finally stop shaking that bag, there's zero chance that watch, it would be put back together in a functioning watch. So when you look at this world, there's so many different aspects to this world, more than what was in that bag of the watch, right? I mean, you look at what he's talking about, the seas, and we look at nature, the birds, the different trees and fruits and the different seasons we have. For me, there has to be a creator. There has to be a God who created it. And I'd venture to say that most of us in here believe that there is a God. There is a God who created this world. But the real question is, what kind of God is he? What's your idea of who God is? Do we truly matter to God? Again, what's your idea of who God is compared to the biblical truth? And to understand that, we have to understand God's character. There's three things I want to point out to everybody about God's character. The first one is God knows about my situation. Psalms 56:8 says, you know how troubled I am. You have kept a record of my tears. So God knows our sadness. God knows what breaks our heart. God knows that we go through pain in our lives. Psalm 69:5 says, oh God, you know how foolish I am. God knows we're going to mess up. He knows we're going to fall short of the glory of God. You know, he's not up there and you do something. There's nothing that we can do down here that will shock God. God's not going to be like, oh my goodness, I can't believe Aaron did that. No, he's not surprised. He knows me better than I know myself. He knows you better than you know yourself. The second thing is God cares about my situation. Psalms 103, 13 and 14. He is like a father to us, tender and sympathetic. He knows what we are made of. He remembers we are dust. See, he knows, again, that we're going to fall short of the glory of God. He knows that we are going to fall in our flesh. But he's tender and sympathetic with us. Jeremiah 31:3 says, I know I loved you with a love that lasts forever. I keep on loving you with a faithful love. See, what we have to understand is God cares for us. And God's love never fails. He loves you on your good days and your bad days. He loves you when you're right and when you're wrong. He loves you when you're serving him and when you're not. God even loves you when you're angry or selfish. And he loves you even when you're breaking his heart. Isn't that amazing? Why? Why does God keep on loving us? He keeps on loving us because his love is unconditional. It's not based on our performance, right? It's based on his character. It's not based on what we do. It's based on who he is. In Romans it says, though we are sinners, Christ died for us. And he did that because he cares for us. And the last thing I want to point out about God's character is God can change me and my situation. And he can change you and your situation. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone, a new life has begun. When you turn from your sin and turn toward Christ, all that junk from your past is forgiven. You had your but God moment when you've given your life to Christ.